48 hours is not a long time in the life of a nation. 48 hours is not enough time to build something new from the ground up. 48 hours is not enough time to renegotiate a 30-year trade relationship from scratch. But 48 hours is exactly enough time to destroy one permanently and completely. Because 48 hours after Trump's steel threat landed in Ottawa, Canada made its move. Not a counter-threat designed to bring Washington back to the negotiating table. Not an emergency diplomatic call asking for a meeting with American trade representatives. Not a press conference filled with carefully worded warnings about consequences and timelines. Canada made a move that most American economists said was impossible to execute this quickly. Canada flipped its entire export map away from the United States in 48 hours flat. Every major Canadian export relationship that pointed south toward America for 3 full decades redirected toward Europe, Asia, and emerging markets that had been waiting for exactly this moment. Reoriented away from American buyers and toward new partners who were ready to sign immediately. Rebuilt on new contractual foundations that do not require Washington's cooperation to function going forward. And here is the specific detail that changes everything about how you understand this trade war. This was not a reaction built in panic inside 48 hours after the steel threat landed. This was a pre-planned, pre-negotiated, pre-positioned strategic document sitting in an Ottawa government office waiting for exactly the right political trigger to give Canada the domestic justification to activate it. Trump's steel threat was not the cause of Canada's export map flip. It was the permission. The permission Canada's trade strategists needed to execute a plan 18 months in the making. And that distinction between reaction and pre-planned execution is the most important thing you will hear today. Before we go any further, hit that subscribe button right now and stay until the very end. Drop a comment below and tell me exactly which state you are currently watching this from today. Because what Canada just did does not hit every American community with the same weight and speed. Where you live determines precisely how fast and how hard this export map flip lands on you. Now, let us build the complete picture of what actually happened and why it matters so much. To understand the full significance of what Canada just did, you need one foundational piece of context. The United States and Canada do not simply trade with each other the way most countries trade. Most countries trade finished goods across borders. You make something, I buy it, the transaction ends there. The United States and Canada built something fundamentally different over 30 years of deliberate economic integration. They built a continental production system where the same product crosses the border multiple times before completion. A car manufactured in Michigan contains Canadian steel, Canadian aluminum, and Canadian parts at every stage. The car's components cross the border 4 to 6 times during production before a single American buys it. The energy powering the factory that builds that car flows through Canadian pipelines into American infrastructure daily. The lumber used to build the dealership selling that car was processed in Canadian mills last year. This is not a trade relationship. This is a single economic organism split across 2 national borders. And Canada just began surgically removing its half of that organism from the American half permanently. The specific mechanism of how Canada flipped its export map matters enormously for understanding what comes next. Canada did not simply announce retaliatory tariffs the way it did during Phase 1 of this conflict. Retaliatory tariffs are a pressure tool. They create pain, but they preserve the underlying relationship structure intact. What Canada's Trade Ministry executed in 48 hours was categorically different from anything in Phase 1's playbook. They activated pre-negotiated framework agreements with European Union member states for Canadian steel and aluminum exports. They signed preliminary supply agreements with South Korean and Japanese manufacturers hungry for stable North American raw material. They formalized discussions with Indian industrial buyers who have been pursuing Canadian resource relationships for several years. They accelerated existing conversations with Australian and New Zealand partners about agricultural trade diversification away from America. And they issued internal directives to Canadian Crown corporations and provincially regulated exporters to begin redirecting immediately. All of this in 48 hours, because all of it had been prepared, negotiated, and ready for months. The European Union did not need convincing. They had been pursuing Canadian supply relationships since the CETA agreement. South Korean manufacturers did not need persuading. Canadian raw materials at competitive prices are exactly what they want. Indian industrial buyers did not hesitate. They have been trying to establish Canadian supply lines for years already. The world was ready to absorb Canadian exports the moment Canada decided to redirect them away from America. And that readiness, that pre-existing global appetite for Canadian supply, is what makes this flip permanent. This is the critical distinction that Washington has not yet communicated honestly to the American public at all. When Canada redirects steel exports to South Korean manufacturers and new contracts get signed and deliveries begin flowing, those relationships develop momentum, trust, and infrastructure that American buyers cannot simply reclaim with a phone call. When Canadian agricultural exporters establish new distribution networks into European markets and those networks prove reliable and profitable, Canadian farmers rationally prioritize those relationships over returning to a market that demonstrated its willingness to weaponize trade access. When Canadian energy producers build new pipeline capacity and liquefied natural gas infrastructure oriented toward Asian markets, that infrastructure does not get dismantled because Washington decides tariffs were a mistake in retrospect. Physical infrastructure, signed contracts, and established trade relationships are not reversible by political rhetoric or tariff rollbacks. They are reversed only by patient, expensive, years-long relationship rebuilding. If the other party chooses to come back. Canada is not guaranteed to choose to come back, and that is the reality Washington is not discussing. Now, let us talk about the American industries that feel this export map flip most immediately and most severely. The first sector in the direct line of fire is American steel manufacturing, and the irony here is devastating. Trump's steel threat was designed to protect American steel workers from what Washington characterized as unfair Canadian competition. The export map flip now threatens to remove Canadian raw material inputs that American steel mills depend on daily. Several American steel facilities in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana process Canadian raw materials as a core part of their production model. When Canada redirects those raw materials toward new buyers in Asia and Europe, American mills face an immediate supply gap. They can source alternatives, but alternative sourcing takes time, involves higher costs, and disrupts production schedules immediately. The steelworkers, Trump's tariff policy was theoretically protecting now face production slowdowns caused directly by Canada's response to that policy. The second sector facing immediate structural disruption is the North American automotive manufacturing complex centered in Michigan and Ontario. No sector in the American economy is more deeply integrated with Canadian supply chains than automobile manufacturing currently is. The just-in-time production model that American auto manufacturers depend on requires parts to cross the border on precise schedules. Canadian parts suppliers who have operated on those precise schedules for decades are now receiving direction to diversify their customer base. When a Canadian parts supplier signs a supply agreement with a European automaker, that capacity is no longer available to Michigan. Not immediately, transition takes time, but the direction of travel is now established and moving with increasing speed. The third sector facing serious and immediate disruption is the American energy market in northern border states specifically. Several northern American states source significant portions of their electricity and heating fuel through Canadian energy infrastructure. Minnesota, Vermont, New York, and Maine have energy systems that are deeply intertwined with Canadian provincial power grids. Canada's export map flip includes accelerated development of LNG export capacity oriented toward Asian markets, not American ones. Every unit of Canadian energy capacity developed for Asian export is capacity that will not be available for American purchase. The fourth sector, and the one that will reach most deeply into ordinary American household budgets, is food and agriculture. Canada supplies $42 billion in food and agricultural products to the United States every single year without interruption. The export map flip activates redirection of Canadian agricultural exports toward European and Asian buyers with immediate effect. Supply gaps in the American food distribution network do not appear on day 1. They appear on day 31. For the first 30 days, existing inventory buffers absorb the disruption, and American grocery prices hold relatively stable. On day 31, reorder cycles hit the redirected supply chain, and distribution centers begin paying premium prices for alternatives. By day 60, those premium costs move directly onto the shelf prices that American families see at checkout counters. We are currently sitting on day 2 of this export map flip timeline right now as you watch this video, which means American households have approximately 28 days before the first price signals begin appearing at grocery stores, and approximately 58 days before the full repricing of affected categories is visible on every American family's grocery receipt. This is not a projection built on economic modeling or worst-case scenario analysis by academic researchers somewhere. This is supply chain arithmetic, inventory buffers, reorder cycles, and alternative sourcing premiums that operates on fixed timelines. The math does not care about press conferences, diplomatic calls, or tariff rollback announcements between now and day 60. The supply chain clock started running the moment Canada activated its export map flip 48 hours ago, and it will run to its conclusion on the shelf prices of American grocery stores, regardless of what Washington says next. What Canada specifically redirected, which contracts are already signed, which American states face the most severe timeline, and whether any intervention can arrive before day 60 changes the outcome for American families. That is exactly what comes next in this video. Stay with me, because every section of what follows connects directly to your household, your community, and your financial future. The 48 hours that just passed already changed the North American economic landscape permanently, and most Americans do not know it yet. The contracts are not theoretical, and they are not still being negotiated somewhere behind closed doors. They are signed, they are dated, and several of them carry immediate delivery obligations starting this quarter. Let us start with the document that nobody in American mainstream media has fully reported on yet. 18 months ago, Canada's Department of International Trade Enterprises began a classified internal project called Trade Resilience Framework. The framework had one specific mandate: identify every major Canadian export relationship pointing south toward America. Then identify alternative buyers for every single one of those export categories in non-American global markets. Then pre-negotiate framework agreements with those alternative buyers so redirection could begin within hours of activation. The project identified 31 major Canadian export categories worth a combined total of $400 billion annually. For each of those 31 categories, Canadian trade officials quietly opened conversations with alternative buyers across 4 continents. They told those buyers that Canada was conducting routine trade diversification planning, which was technically accurate and completely true. What they did not say was that diversification planning had a specific trigger point attached to every single agreement. That trigger point was any American trade action that crossed a threshold defined inside the framework document itself. Trump's steel threat crossed that threshold within 6 hours of the announcement reaching Ottawa's trade ministry offices. The activation order went out within 12 hours, giving Canadian exporters a further 36 hours to begin execution. That is how Canada flipped its entire export map in 48 hours. The work was already completely done. Now let us go category by category through the most significant redirections that are already actively in motion today. The first and most immediately significant redirection involves Canadian steel and aluminum exports worth approximately $62 billion annually. For 3 decades, the majority of that material flowed south into American mills, manufacturers, and construction supply chains. Under the Trade Resilience Framework activation, Canadian steel producers received direction to prioritize new framework agreements immediately. South Korean manufacturer POSCO, the world's 6th largest steel producer, had been in framework discussions with Canada for 14 months. Within 36 hours of Canada's activation order, POSCO confirmed it would absorb an additional 8 million tons of Canadian steel annually. Japanese manufacturer Nippon Steel confirmed a framework agreement for Canadian aluminum supply, covering the next 5 production years. The European Union's steel import framework, expanded under the CETA trade agreement, immediately activated additional Canadian supply channels. These are not letters of intent or memoranda of understanding. These are binding supply agreements with delivery schedules attached. The second major redirection involves Canadian agricultural exports, and this is the category that hits American families most directly. Canada exports $42 billion in food and agricultural products to the United States every single year currently. The framework identified European Union agricultural import programs as the primary alternative destination for redirected Canadian farm exports. Germany, the Netherlands, and France have been seeking stable North American agricultural supply relationships for several years running. Within 48 hours of activation, Canadian agricultural export boards received direction to open formal supply discussions with EU buyers. The discussions are not starting from zero. 18 months of preliminary framework work means they are starting from near completion. Canadian canola exports, worth approximately $12 billion annually, are being redirected toward European biofuel and food processing markets. Canadian pulse crops, lentils, peas, chickpeas, are being redirected toward Indian buyers who have been actively seeking stable supply. Canadian processed food exports are being redirected toward Asian retail markets that have been pursuing Canadian brand relationships for years. Each of these redirections removes supply from the American food distribution network that has depended on it for decades. And each redirection, once established and profitable, creates a commercial relationship that does not reverse simply because Washington asks. The third major redirection involves Canadian energy, and this is the category with the longest and most permanent consequences. Canada currently supplies approximately 20% of America's crude oil imports through integrated pipeline infrastructure built over 50 years. Several northern American states, Minnesota, Vermont, Maine, New York, source significant electricity through Canadian provincial grid connections. The framework's energy redirection component focuses on building LNG export infrastructure oriented toward Asian markets rather than American ones. British Columbia's LNG Canada facility, already under construction, becomes the centerpiece of this energy export diversification strategy. Every $1 billion of LNG export capacity developed for Asian markets is capacity permanently unavailable for American energy purchase. The pipeline infrastructure economics of energy trade mean that once Asian-oriented infrastructure gets built, it does not get rebuilt for America. This is not a 5-year consequence or a 10-year consequence. This is a generational energy relationship shift beginning right now. Now let us connect all of these redirections directly to the financial life of every American household watching this video. The four sectors most directly disrupted, steel, agriculture, automotive parts, and energy, employ a combined 8.3 million American workers. Those 8.3 million workers represent direct employment in industries whose supply chains are now actively being redirected away from America. Their wages, their job security, their community's economic health, all connected to supply relationships Canada is now redirecting elsewhere. The pension funds holding stock in American steel, auto manufacturing, agricultural processing, and energy companies face immediate valuation pressure. The S&P 500 has direct exposure to every sector being disrupted by Canada's export map flip right now. The average American 401k holding a broad market index fund has exposure to the disruption through multiple sector positions simultaneously. This is not a story about trade policy happening in a government building somewhere far from your financial life. This is a story about the valuation of assets sitting inside the retirement account that funds your future directly. Now let us address the question that every serious analyst is asking about Washington's potential response to this situation. Washington has three possible response paths available, and each one carries consequences that American households need to understand clearly. Response path 1, immediate tariff rollback, involves Washington reversing the steel threat that triggered Canada's framework activation entirely. A full tariff rollback would theoretically remove Canada's stated justification for maintaining the export map redirection in active status. But here's the problem with response path 1 that Washington's trade advisors understand and have not communicated publicly yet. The contracts already signed between Canadian exporters and their new Asian and European buyers do not dissolve because tariffs roll back. POSCO's 8 million ton steel agreement with Canada does not get cancelled because Washington decides the steel threat was counterproductive. The European Union's expanded Canadian agricultural supply agreements do not get unwound because Trump reverses course on tariffs. Commercial contracts, signed between willing parties in good faith, do not get cancelled because one country's political situation changes. Response path. One removes the political justification for new redirections, but it does not reverse the redirections already executed. Response path 2, escalation, involves Washington responding to Canada's export map flip with additional and broader tariff measures. This is the response path that Canada's trade resilience framework was specifically designed to make as painful as possible for America. Every additional American tariff escalation gives Canada's government additional domestic political justification to accelerate the framework's execution further. Every escalation pushes more Canadian exporters toward framework agreements that are already negotiated and waiting for activation triggers. Escalation is the response path most likely to be chosen by Washington, and most likely to produce the worst outcomes for American families. Response path 3, negotiated framework agreement, involves Washington offering Canada a comprehensive trade relationship reset covering multiple sectors simultaneously. This is the response path that trade economists universally identify as producing the best outcomes for both American and Canadian households. It is also the response path least likely to emerge from the current political environment in Washington in the near term. Because a negotiated framework agreement requires Washington to acknowledge that Canada's leverage in this relationship is real and significant, and acknowledging that leverage is politically difficult for an administration whose trade narrative is built on projecting American strength and dominance. The most likely outcome in the next 30 days is a combination of escalation rhetoric and back-channel negotiation happening simultaneously. Public escalation gives Washington's political base the strength narrative it needs. Back-channel negotiation attempts to limit the commercial damage. But back-channel negotiation cannot undo signed contracts. It can only influence the pace of new redirections going forward, which means the damage already done in 48 hours is permanent regardless of which response path Washington chooses to pursue. Now let us bring this down to the most specific and personal level, the timeline that hits your household directly. Day 1 through day 30. Prices hold, inventory buffers absorb the supply disruption, and most Americans notice nothing unusual. Day 31 through day 60. Reorder cycles hit the redirected supply chain, and alternative sourcing premiums begin moving to shelves. Day 61 through day 90. Full repricing is established across affected categories, and the new price reality becomes permanent. We are on day 2 of this timeline right now, and the majority of Americans have no awareness of it. The specific product categories facing the steepest price increases, the specific states facing the earliest timeline, and the 3 actions that American households can take before day 30 to meaningfully reduce their exposure. That is exactly what Part 3 covers next. Do not skip ahead, and do not close this video because the action framework in Part 3 is the most valuable information in this entire series. The 48 hours that already passed built the foundation of a new North American economic reality without most Americans noticing it. Part 3 shows you exactly what to do before day 30 makes that reality impossible to prepare for any further.